Thank you. We are back at the MSU Comics Forum Online 2021. I'm happy to serve as the moderator for this panel on representation and comics. I'm sorry to say that our panelist, Beth LePensee, cannot be here. She had an unexpected death in her family. So we'll miss Beth and wish her our deepest condolences. But the rest of our panelists are here, and I'm happy to be able to introduce them. Um, First up, I'd like to introduce John Jennings, who is a professor of media and cultural studies and a cooperating faculty member at the Department of Creative Writing at the University of California at Riverside. Many people probably know John for his comics work and his scholarly work, and his work really centers on intersectional narratives regarding identity politics and popular culture. Of course, you probably know his book, Eisner Award-winning co-edited book, The Blacker the Ink: Construction of Black Identity in Comics and Sequential Art. And you probably know some of the conferences and cons that he's organized, like the Schaumburg Black Comic Book Festival or the NorCal Black Comic Arts Festival. Uh, John is also, of course, an author and artist. His most recent book, of course, is an adaptation of Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower. There's a lots of work that we can associate with John. I'm gonna go on, but of course, it's a great honor to have him here.
Thank you.
No less as a scholar and is Andy Konka. Konka. Andy is at the University of South Carolina, Sumter. He's professor of English, and I didn't know this division chair. So administration, that's a thing. Um, he's the author of several articles and books, but his forthcoming book will probably be of great importance to our audience. It's The Life and Comics of Howard Cruz, Taking Risks in the Service of Truth from Rutgers University Press. This is one of the first critical biographies of Cruz and promises to spark a lot of investigation and conversation about a critical artist. So these are our two presenters. It's great to have them here. And so I'm going to go in order of my sort of introduction and give John opportunity to sort of present, and then we'll follow that up with Andy, and then we'll have a little bit of a conversation, and then turn towards questions and comments from the audience.
Okay.
Take it away, John.
Thank you so much. It's funny because I was just on social media posting about diversity in comics. There was a gentleman who hadn't read comics since like the 1970s and was lamenting the lack of representation of Black superheroes, and was also talking about the recent what do you call it news of Ta-Nehisi Coates is going to be writing a Superman movie with J.J. Abrams, I guess, producing, and was like, what's going on with this, And it's funny because, as an artist, I think a lot about this as well. And I talked to my friend Stacey Robinson about this too, is that, most of us who come into this kind of like genre writing and genre work really, really love these characters outside of, you know, outside of their race, right? I mean, like my favorite superhero is Daredevil, like always has been, right? Not Black Panther or the Falcon, what have you. I love those characters too, but they just didn't speak to me as much as Matt Murdock does, right? But on the same token, there is this extra pressure, I think, for Black content creators to always have to deal with the fact that we can't just be writers or creators um, who are making this work who just happen to be Black. We actually, it seems like we always have to deal with the constrictions, the constructions, the systemic issues around race, which is not fair. It's not fair. I'm very excited that that a character like Superman would be written by a Black writer. I think that's really interesting. I think it could be fun. I mean, I really enjoyed his a lot of the things he did with Captain America, for instance. So which is a very similar character in some ways. So those are something that was just something that was mulling in my head from like a previous thing. But a lot of my work, not even a lot of my work, all of my work is about it's about representation in various media. As a creator, as an editor, And behind me, for instance, is this Bill Sienkiewicz piece celebrating the milestone media characters, right? Those of you who are in the know realize that they just put out a zero issue, reissued a zero issue with Milestone, and have announced that in April we're going to see new stories for these characters. A lot of us loved for a long time. Of course, Milestone, was created in 1990s by a coalition of really really talented creators who have male creators who happen to be black, who are working in the comics industry, kind of pushing back against some of the ways that black characters have been treated throughout history in that particular medium, unfortunately, and this was in during the heyday of when a lot of comics in the 90s were being a lot more experimental too. You had characters like Spawn that were coming from like Image, and Shadow Man out of Valiant. So it was an interesting time, I think, in comics, and it's really cool to see them coming back. I don't really have a presentation. I definitely want to talk about. I don't. I mean, it's like I feel like it should be a conversation. I do want to talk about like some of the things that I've seen that I'm really excited about. There was recently a New York Times article that was talking about the rise of Afrofuturism, which has been a catchphrase around black speculative culture and representation, for good or for ill. Some stuff is Afrofuturist and some of it isn't, but a lot of it, but all of it is speculative though, and I find that that's really exciting. So it mentions stuff like Far Sector by N.K. Jemisin from DC Comics, which is like a black woman as a Green Lantern, and but it's also like it's almost like a Western too. Like she's a sheriff, like in this on the outskirts of of the galaxy. So and actually this kind of links up with some of Julian's research too around like the creation of the superhero, like the genealogy of the superhero. Also stuff like Roy Coupe's new venture with Dark Horse, where he's going to be doing Nigerian American or Nigerian characters, or maybe even just I'm not sure if it's going to be Pan Africanist characters, that with a large distributor and creative comics. So that's going to be really really great too. And then of course I just we just put out our first book from Megascope, which is a line of books that I am the curator and co-founder of with Abrams Comic Arts, who who published me and Damian Duffy's two adaptations of Octavia Butler's work. And Megascope essentially is going to be dedicated to representations of folk of color across the board. We're going to be looking at basically BIPOC subjectivity through the lens of speculative fiction. So if you want to, I can show you a couple of things, or we can show it. I can show you stuff later. I'm excited to be on the panel. I don't want to take up too much time because I'm, like I said, I'm kind of rambling. But because I just have too many things in my head about this. Because
but that's perfect, and we'll throw it over to Andy, and then
yeah, let's
we'll
mix it
drop back into the
up.
group and ramble.
I feel a little bad about having something that's like prepared and a speech like written out, but I have to do that. I don't speak off the cuff very well. So let me go ahead and share my screen. And so the research I'm doing now, since I finished the Howard Cruz book, and stuff I've been doing for a long time, is about the publishers Dell and Gold Key Comics, because these two publishers don't get talked about all that much, and it's unfortunate in a lot of ways because, for example, Dell put out the Western series Lobo, the 2 issues in 1967 that are the first African American character to have his own solo comic. So and they were also both incredibly popular during their existence. So my general goal with this research is to try to see how our understanding of comics history changes if these two publishers, who had a shared history, that Gold Key split off from a relationship they had with Dell. It's pretty complicated, I won't get into. but if we see them as having a more central role in the industry, because their combined share of published comics at the time, and that's in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, equaled any of the major publishers of the period. And so one area that I argue, which could change significantly, is our understanding of diverse representation in comics. For example, in April 1966, we treat that as this watershed moment in comics history, with the first appearance of Black Panther and Fantastic Four 52. However, in that same month, give or take a week, comics readers could also find the first issue of I Spy, which is kind of obscured, I think, by the figures, but that's okay. We don't need to see that. And the second issue of Del's Hogan's Heroes, both of which featured prominent Black characters, but didn't have the same kind of fanfare that these other comics did. In fact, if we look at the output of Del and Goldkey TV adaptations from 1966 to 1973, you can see that these two publishers offered numerous comics with diverse casts, and this is just a sampling. There's probably there's well over a dozen comics that they published during the 7-year period that would fall under this category. And one area I like to zoom in on in this brief talk is the art style used in these comics. So specifically, these comics relied very heavily on photo reference, which can sometimes create a jarring stylistic shift within the same comic. On the extreme end of the photo reference is the use of stats, where a photo-based illustration of a character's head is pasted into the comic panel and reused throughout the comic. Unfortunately, this is on the wrong side of the screen. But in this set of consecutive panels from Room 222, a comic based on the late 60s, early 70s TV series, one stat for each character of history teacher Pete Dixon on the left, played by Lloyd Haynes, and Principal Seymour Kaufman on the right, played by Michael Constantine, is reused in 3 of the 4 panels on this page. And both are taken, in fact, from the same stock photo. So it's just that as you can kind of see with the images of Pete Dixon, his head is just kind of tilted in different directions with the exact same illustration. So what is the impact? So I'm going to kind of ask a series of questions about what we do with stuff like this. So what impact does this heavy and jarring use of photo reference have on our understanding of representation? If we can, for example, if we compare the style choice between characters in the same comic, in that 4th panel, or in later, when there's not a character that comes from the TV series, but is Black, how are they depicted differently from the photo references? Do these comparisons highlight the way in which artists rely on visual stereotypes in their depiction of diverse characters that might not have been apparent otherwise without that comparison? And shifting to the content of these comics, another question arises: how much do these comics address social issues in terms of diversity, civil rights, and racial equality, especially in the late 60s and early 70s? Room 222 was a show that addressed these topics all the time, but the comic book doesn't to any great extent. And I can get into more detail about some of the plots of this comic later. So the big question I have is then, why aren't these comics discussed more often? By representing cross-media properties and featuring photo covers like these, do they have more to do with TV history than with comics history? What happens though when we put them in the conversation, particularly about Black representation in comics? How do they reframe our discussion of, say, Black Panther or Luke Cage and other characters if we know that their comics shared the newsstands with comics like these? What, in fact, might those newsstands have looked like to comics readers? And for readers seeking out more diverse comics at the time, were these even the comics that they wanted? So that's where I stop with this, and go ahead and talk.
Okay, so that's awesome.
That is
seriously,
great.
those are really compelling questions, actually. Because I think a lot of times, I mean, I haven't seen a lot of those comics, because generally when I'm thinking about, the mainstream comic, it's been he's been taken over by superheroes and other speculative work. But yeah, of course, those would also fall into that realm. You should. Have you written a paper about this yet?
Yeah. So there's a larger article on this in that massive book that Frederick Aldama just put out, like the Oxford Companion or something like that to comics. So yeah, it's in there. But I'm writing a larger book about Dell and Goldkey comics, and this is going to be a chapter in that too.
Interesting. Okay, yeah, because you bring up a really good point. Like, especially the idea of like how do people want to be represented? That's really interesting. And then also the mechanics of, because I actually have had to do that myself, as an artist. To actually, when me and Damien worked on an Obama comic once. We don't talk about it because the editor like totally jacked up our. We totally jacked it up. So we was like, don't put our names on this.
Oh wow.
It was that bad. But I had to, I had to figure, because the character had to look like Obama, right? And then the other thing was we just did that with with the I'm Alfonso Jones book, because oh man, I can't think of his name right now. Amadou Diallo is actually in it as a character, but there's very few pictures of him, that are used for the public, So we had to figure out some really interesting ways to utilize the same photo. It is awkward, and it's a really interesting thing. It reminds me of too. It reminds me of when John Van Fleet was doing the X-Files comics too, because he was using xerography a lot, and so he made it work a lot better just because of his stylistic, his aesthetics, But yeah, when you're working with like properties and likenesses, it can get really, really dicey,
Yeah, and a lot of the reason that stats were used is not, some of it is a real shortcut for the artists, but other times it was because the actors demanded that their likenesses be used, and that the characters in the comics looked like it. And John, what you were talking about just reminds me of when, I don't know if you ever heard Sanford Green talk about working on that Method Man comic that he did.
Never heard him talk about it. No,
just to include the entire Wu-Tang Clan in that comic, each image had to go through, I think he said, like every lawyer, like each one of them had a separate lawyer, and each one had to approve. It sounds like a nightmare to deal with, like a living person who has that kind of legal requirements for the use of their image.
Yeah, it also speaks. I mean, it's kind of. I mean, I guess it's on topic too, but the way that different media are looked at, as far as like the class, like comics are still like the low man on the totem pole, so to speak. But when you think about like transmedia stats, it's like film and TV seem like they're the big kahuna when it comes to representation. So seems like a lot of times the comics have to go lockstep with the things that are put out, just because of how popular television and film are. It's interesting. Seems like a totally different panel, but it's utterly fascinating. Anyway.
Well, we do have a couple of questions already been put to the panel. I do want to say, I'm gonna drift from moderator to participant, but the question here for me is, when we're thinking about Dell and Goldkey and what is the placement of the transmedia object in our narrative about comics, right? Because I totally recognize what Andy is saying. I Spy, almost, Dell has all these media comics. They have Black characters, but those are in fact characters that we can easily situate in a broader media history of representation for Black people,
right,
vis-a-vis television. But in the context of transformation related to comics, I would hesitate to say, oh, we should put this on par with Black Panther. No,
right. No,
we can't.
No.
So
yeah,
but as when we look at the comic book rack for the buyer, they're much more likely to buy one of those media tie-in comics because they have the further adventures of characters that they see on a weekly basis in comic form, right?
Yeah.
So the irony here is that we laud Black Panther as scholars for good reason, but the audience might be consuming these Dell comics with greater intensity because of this cross media dialogue.
Hmm.
Yeah.
It's a brand, you
Mhm.
know.
Brand,
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple things on that, because one of the things then to think about is where do comics fit into the larger media culture in terms of this
Mhm.
representation. And one of these things these comics highlight is that they're lagging behind uh, what television was doing.
Right.
But and I think that that idea of the newsstand is, that's why I kind of put this out there, that we're somebody buying Black Panther, the Fantastic Four 52 on the newsstand is not buying it in isolation. There's other stuff on there and the other choice. I don't know how I don't know to say that someone's going to go for the I Spy comic instead of Fantastic Four, because these comics never lasted very long. I mean, they had
Right.
like 2 or 3 issues. And I always wonder like who was buying a Room 222 comic in the first place. I don't know if anybody's
Right.
old enough to remember that show. I do.
I've never heard of the show before.
And and it's an odd comic because the 2 main characters are the African American history teacher and African American guidance counselor.
That's interesting.
And they weren't, and there's but the TV show, that the kind of premier character, breakout character was, our actress was Karen Valentine, who I remember being, when I was a kid, was like this everybody loved Karen Valentine, and she only shows up in maybe 2 panels in the entire series. So whoever wrote that, and we don't really know who, Jack Sparling drew it, but we don't have an identity for the writer, I don't think, didn't latched in on these particular characters. Now, I always wonder like who bought that comic. The only kind of scenario I imagine is some like grandparents saying to their grandkids, like, I know you like comics, so here, right, I bought you this Room 222 comic, and it's like, oh, that's not what I want.
I want the Star Trek comic.
Yeah, well, the Star Trek comic is an interesting case, because when in that series from Gold Key, when Uhura is not identified by name, she's colored white.
I remember that. Yep.
Yeah, and so there's a whole nother paper on that.
Yeah, see, that's the thing, is like a lot of those characters, and even though I love them, they could fall, they teeter on being like tokenized in a lot of ways too, as much as we love them,
the Gold Key Star Trek is clearly, someone was given a vaguely described notion of what Star Trek was, because if you read the Gold Key Star Trek series, the person does not, they have not actually seen Star Trek.
So
nothing like on that series.
They violate the Prime Directive. Like
they violate the Prime Directive. The transfers don't work right. The characterizations are wrong. Yes, they get the colors of the character wrong, but they also get basic things about
everything about wrong. That's funny. Okay.
Right. Spock isn't right. I mean, like, that's a
that makes me want to go back and read those.
You should go back and read them. I read those, and I was like, wow, that's really interesting.
Oh my God. Okay, that's something.
But we actually have to answer the question from the audience.
Oh yeah, that's right.
We're ignoring it, right?
I was thinking about the this idea of hierarchy of media, because the question that I just answered on Facebook, the gentleman who hadn't read comics since like the 1970s was talking about representations in film, and because he's been watching the movies, right? So, and maybe he hasn't even seen like stuff like Black Lightning or other like streaming services. It's interesting. Anyway, sorry, I'm gonna shut up.
So how do the panelists think about representing specific individual experiences, whether based on a real person or not, as potentially in tension with representing groups and or histories?
So you mean like represent like someone who actually existed, who is,
right? So what's the? I think the question has to do with like how do we think about sort of like fictive histories representing the experiences versus the real histories, right? So
I mean,
there's a tension here in part because let's think about the Black Panther as an example. Is Black Panther a key watermark in African American history, or is it a key watermark in global diasporic history, right? Because that character's not American,
Right.
right?
And he's not African either, actually.
Right, like,
Well,
well,
because he's Wakanda,
well,
because Wakanda doesn't exist. So it's like,
Wakanda doesn't exist, right? Yeah.
yeah. So that's
So
the
he's
other,
a mythical. He's a mythical black person
right.
that is supposed to represent like
Sorry, but
a number of
most black people.
post-colonial,
I'm sorry.
right?
That's racist,
Imagine
but
white post-colonial frameworks,
we're
right?
imagined.
So,
You know what I'm saying?
okay.
No, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think there's always going to be tensions between like fictional. That's yeah. I think there's always going to be tensions. I can't see how they couldn't be. Because a lot of times people are only learning about people from various backgrounds through the media they consume, which is why having diverse media is so important. I think or having folk who are of that space, who's being talked about, being in control of some of the narrative. I don't know. I mean, that's an interesting question because I like alternative histories and fictionalized histories, and because it talks about the things that aren't there, and I'm really into what Sadia Hartman calls like critical fabulation as well. That's one of my favorite things. You basically you're filling in the holes where you think things should have been, kind of thing. Yeah. So as a basing something off of something that exists, and kind of remixing and thinking about it, I think actually is a type of critique too. So I don't know. I don't know if I'm answering the question, but those are things that popped in my head about it.
Well, kind of playing off that question, John. I mean, I've talked to you, I think, in the past about teaching Kindred, and I'm doing it in a month or so again.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things I wonder about as a creator who has to make choices about this stuff is, for my students, that they may not read a lot about slavery,
right.
otherwise, and so this, Kindred might be the only thing they've read, other than maybe having something in a history class.
Yeah.
So do you feel like a sense of responsibility about kind of that kind of representation, even beyond like taking what the source material gives you, into something like that?
Yeah, I think so. The thing, Kindred was, well, it was difficult in some ways, but easy in other ways, because honestly, our third collaborator, really our fourth collaborator, we kind of edited, but our third collaborator was David Butler, who definitely did all of her research and then some, seriously, which is what she did for all of her books. So the authenticity of the space is something that we really didn't have to worry about that much. I was concerned with like making sure that the costumes and other period aspects were correct as much as I could. But yeah, there is a sense of responsibility, Andrew, definitely. I'm working on a period piece right now with I'm pitching with Nalo Hopkinson and Steve Bissett right now, actually. And we're very concerned about getting certain aspects right, and also remixing certain parts of it that are fictionalized and like I said, fabulized, so, and yeah, but you definitely want to make sure that certain touch points are correct, I think. And yeah, because I think a lot of times too, like when people are writing stories like that, I never would have thought I'd be writing something that would be adopted for a course. No one thinks like, I'm going to write this treatise on slavery. No one. I mean,
yeah.
You want to do a great story that inspires people and inspires you. But yeah, but I think if you're writing, historical fiction, I think it's your obligation to get stuff right. So yeah.
Got another question from a chat. I want to make sure that we get to, and this is I think a reasonable question. It goes to markets and histories and things like that. Would it be reasonable to assume that a contributing factor for the lack of discussion about diversity in Dell and Gold Key books is the collector's market and its investment in superhero comics?
Yeah, I mean that makes sense. I mean, I think the market, the people who collect Dell and Gold Key, especially the TV and movie adaptations, are more in the like kind of TV film collecting side, and not so much the comic collecting side. And be honest, the content of these comics is pretty terrible straight across the board. So they're collecting them for the photo covers mainly, and as kind of artifacts of that. of that era and that show. So that makes total sense. And I think another aspect of it is that these things can't really be collected. Um, somebody else owns those licenses, and um, there isn't, there probably isn't a market about some of the stuff's been collected. I think like Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea and Star Trek have collected because there is a market for those, but I can't imagine anybody wanting a collection of Room 222 comics or The Young Lawyers, which was a show that lasted 14 episodes.
Okay.
The Young Rebels, right?
Yeah, The Young Rebels with
weird-
Louis Gossett Jr.
Gossett Jr. Right, yeah.
How long was Mod Squad on? Anybody know?
Mod Squad,
Mod
the TV?
Squad, yeah.
It was
I
on
think
long enough to be syndicated, so it had to be over 100 episodes, I would guess.
Interesting. Huh. I don't think I ever knew that.
And of course, the other thing about the one time I have seen people have comic interest related to Del and Key is the possibility that like an artist who's goes on or has like a corresponding superhero legacy, they did something in one of these things, like, oh, I want to have that. That's the other driver.
Yeah.
But much of the narrative related to the Del and Gold Key is around television history or a broader media history, which isn't necessarily the same collector's market. And so, we do get to this question of that kind of appeal. We have
Ditko drew a couple issues of the Hogan's Heroes comic.
Oh.
So that's, the Ditko collectors, drive the price of that series up.
Interesting. Okay.
We got another question here. When we're talking about representation, diverse media, and own voices, is there a concern that the ways that representation done by marginalized folks makes presenting a very narrow range of possibilities of who the marginalized could be, right? So I think they're sort of asking about when you're looking at something like Afrofuturism that emerges from the African diaspora, should we be concerned about the vision of the future being represented from within the marginalized background? Should there be concerns about experiences being represented from, I think, a broader set of frameworks, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's, I wonder if like concern is the right one, it's the right word to say. I think that that people from various backgrounds are representing themselves. I don't think it's, and even with Afrofuturism, I mean, it's just like an umbrella term for Black speculative culture in general. So it's like, there are people from the continent of Africa who are making speculative work. I mean, like I said, Roy Coupe is Nigerian American. I think he's primarily making like Nigerian,
right. His unique universe, the unique verse is completely African.
That's right. It's African. Yeah.
None of those people, none of those comics take place in America.
Right.
It's completely an African Nigerian. I mean, it's Lagoon City. It's Lagos.
Exactly. Legos, exactly. So and you have people like Nettie Okorafor who does African futurism and African Jujuism, right? Which are totally this is how the framing that she's using for the work she's doing. I don't know. I think that this what's happened is like what we're being afraid of is like Afrofuturism in the mainstream has become like a catch-all for everything that is Black and magical and speculative, which that happens because it's very little nuance in the market. My mentor Dora Moore used to always say that insiders see content, outsiders see form, right? And form is always easier to sell, so that's the thing that's happening too, is like what's happened is larger corporations and larger entities have figured out that there's a market for this stuff. So because we are in a capitalist system. So that's something to think about. But I don't know if marginalized creators are really concerned with it as much as some folk think that they are. I don't know, because there's so many different ways to put out stories too. You know, I mean, so I don't know. It's funny. I was just having a conversation with with a friend of mine who was lamenting the fact that she's a very popular black cartoonist, and everyone is actually not looking at the fact that she's a very talented artist. Period. You know what I'm saying? So she's like, I really just want to be looked at as a really talented artist, and everyone wants to have these conversations about my identity, which is as important to me and my skill set. You know what I'm saying? That's really interesting to me too, because at the end of the day, I think any creator, because I've seen Christopher Priest talk about that too. He's like, I can write everything. I don't necessarily want to be looked at as a black writer. No, look at as a writer who is black by by, and that's how I started as a cartoonist as well. I was like, well, I just want to be a great cartoonist. And then I realized, like, oh, I could actually make like a couple thousand black superheroes, and and we'd still be underrepresented. I think that's changing now, but at the time when I was starting out, it was definitely a concern. I was like, okay, well, I was politicized around the idea of representation, because you also want other people to see your subjectivity too, because it's dangerous for us to not be seen as subject. You know what I'm saying? Like it's dangerous for my son, who is a little black boy, to not be seen as being subject in the country that we live in. So the more that we concretize our subjectivity in various media, I think it's better for everybody. So anyway, I don't know if that even answered the question. I just went off on a little soliloquy. Sorry. Stuff that I think about a lot these days.
Well, John, what you just said makes me think about like you mentioned Far Sector, like what the future of the character Jo is going to be. I mean, she's showing up in other comics now that Jemison's not writing.
That's correct.
And I have mixed feelings about that, but when you're talking about having a character that readers can see themselves in, that's really important. How far are they going to move away from what Jemison's doing with that character?
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, it's interesting because I was fortunate enough to be like interviewed by NPR yesterday, and I was on a conversation with Jesse Holland, who is the co-editor of the Black Panther prose book with like Nikki Giovanni and like Stephen Barnes and Tenerife Dew. And I was like, what? So anyway, he was talking about the fact that it was odd for him because the T'Challa that he wrote for the adaptation of Who is the Black Panther, the Reggie Hudlin and John Romita Jr. book, which is kind of seminal Black Panther book too. It's one of the canon books. Is he changed T'Challa, enough, because things had to be updated, and changed from the original comic book to be a prose book, and he was like, he tweaked him to make him his T'Challa. And then what was difficult for him as the editor for this collection that he's doing is like everybody had a different version of the same character. And it was like really odd. He's like, this isn't my, and he realized that there's this kind of possession that you have with the character, because you make it your character, So I'm curious to see how NK will respond to, Joe Mullen being in, Sojourner Mullen being in like the new Future State JLA, right? Because she's in there, right? Yeah. So I like the character a lot. I love the book. So it's really good. All right.
Well, there's a huge question, I think, about the marketplace and its influence on these characters, right? So the recent news that Ta-Nehisi Coates is going to get the write a Superman story, J.J. Abrams, but he's not writing Clark Kent, right? Like that's not how the story goes.
Wait, hold on. Is he writing a black Superman?
He's writing a black Superman.
Oh,
like, that's the story. Like, yeah, that he want to do a black Superman. They want to do Cal Zod, right? Val Zod.
Wait a minute. Wait, hold up. They buried the lead on that. Hold up. Wait, because here's the thing. Because I just kind of looked out of the corner of my eye.
No, if you really read through it, it's like, oh yeah, we want to do a Superman, but they want to do the black Superman. They want to do Cal Zod, Val Zod.
Oh, that's interesting.
The one who's the president of the United States that looks like Obama, right? Created by Grant Morrison.
Oh, so
which actually makes a lot more sense, because I was like, really? And of course, Superman, at this point, there are lots of different versions of Superman. There's Superman on TV.
That's a good
There's
point. That's a good point.
Superman's on in movies. There's different versions of the Flash. There are different versions of these characters, and so that opens the door perhaps for you can remix them, right? Like, we forget, or I think it's important to remember, think about the controversy when Michael B. Jordan played the Human Torch and how much hatred he got for doing that. I don't think that same level of antagonism would emerge for a character being reimagined. At least I like to think that is the case. I say that out loud, and I realize that's probably not a great idea.
There are a lot of really like very problematic racist folk who like these characters too.
Right.
Some of them were deployed, on our internet insurrection. You know what I'm saying?
So, but almost all the things that we touched upon, I've touched upon, like, the influence of the market. Andy's point about Gold Key and Dell producing a number of Black characters in comics, but we tend to ignore them. Perhaps we do that because of the genre, the transmedia objects that they're connected to, and a clearer, cleaner narrative around comic books being attached to particular characters and particular um, developments of those story universes. But in our contemporary landscape, there is a question here about these marginalized stories and how they relate to communities that are consuming them and entities that are producing them, right? Like, at some level, is there always going to be this tension around this of exploiting the market potential of diversity versus trying to tell more authentic stories? I mean, how do you think about this question, right? Is it possible for us to be as diverse as possible when we're talking about a capital market?
Yeah, that is the question, really. I mean, because on one particular, and it's funny. I was just on a Zoom with Kari Randolph and a bunch of folk from Skybound, right? And we're talking about excellence, and which is a great book, by the way. And Kari was like, he's been extremely busy, busier than he's ever been. Uh, Kari Randolph's been working in comics for a long time, and now that people are realizing, like, oh, wait a minute, you know what? There are like these internal dialogues about who we're hiring. Like I know people who right now are so busy that they've turned down like massive jobs, because of the fact that they are now being called to do stuff because of the fact that they happen to be very, very talented and a Black woman or a Latina woman, And I mean, it's a really, really difficult thing because first of all, like capitalism distorts narrative, you know, that's one of the things, especially when you look at like, the idea of a sequel and the way that what the hell is Marvel time, these types of things. It's like, why are these superheroes immortal? You know what I'm saying? You have to actually create elseworlds to kill off a character because, otherwise that character is forever. It always has to be like 23, 30, whatever, right? I mean, those are different types of concessions that you have to make in the marketplace because corporations are, they want to continue to make money off of these characters, and the comic book has always been about the market. It's never been like, oh, I want to make an artistic thing. No, that comes later. These comics were made probably they're just probably like very disposable, right? And they were probably made for the working class folk, who are reading these and discarding them off of trains and buses and things like that. We're not supposed to be scholars of comics. The three of us were not supposed to exist, around this medium, So yeah, I mean, it's funny because I was just in that post that I made. One of the things that I asked was like, well, because people are always like, well, they're always race bending characters and stuff like that, and I was like, well, what it is that the legacy character is actually part of the superhero genre, since the beginning. I mean, if you think about it, like the Phantom probably was the first like really serious like legacy character, right? And then that gets picked up by the superhero. It's a really cool idea, right? The idea of a mantle being passed down from generation to generation. It just so happens that some of these characters happen to be Black. So my whole thing is like, do you really have an issue with legacy characters? Or do you have an issue with your racism and your sexism and your homophobia and all the isms that you're dealing with? That's the way I look at it personally. because it's just the way the market functions. I mean, Miles Morales makes sense to me, you know. But then I was like, well, what is the most recent super successful superhero that isn't a legacy character that is, you know, that is super popular right now? Like, who would that be that isn't a legacy character but comes out of comics?
That
Is it Deadpool?
I was thinking Deadpool, right?
Mm.
right.
Right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it
So
would
it
be
had to be. It has
Deadpool.
to be Deadpool. Maybe it doesn't have to be Deadpool, but I'm like, it's about to be
I mean,
Invincible.
it depends on how you define success, right?
Well, yeah.
Are you defining this as this character was created and published multiple, for years?
No,
Then
I'm
it
talking
would be
about like
Deadpool.
no, I'm talking
I
about like
mean,
my mama know my. So for me, it's like first of all, mainstream comics to me is an oxymoron. First
right,
of all,
yeah,
yeah, because it's like if your mama don't know the thing or
right,
your grandma
yeah,
don't know what it is, it's not famous. You know,
right, yeah.
my mama
It's
know what Deadpool is. You see what I'm saying?
right, yeah,
Let's be real
yeah,
about it.
yeah,
Yeah, she don't. She
yeah,
might not know these other characters. You know, she don't know the Crimson Avenger, right? But she know
right,
who Deadpool is because of the movie. My wife became an X-Men fan because of the damn movies, not the cartoons, not because of the comic books. She didn't even know that they were comic books.
right,
So that's not so X-Men to her was not mainstream, you know, until the cartoons. You see what I'm saying? There's these different
right,
levels of fame. So for me, like Invincible is about to become that, right? Because Invincible is about to get a cartoon, and now we're going back to these
right,
hierarchies because
right.
Invincible, there's like how many issues of Invincible? That was a
It's
long.
it's 100. It's at least 100 and
It's a long, yeah, and it was created like when did Kirkman create Invincible? Like 90s.
I think it was like 2002.
Yeah, so it's about to be Invincible, but yeah, I think it's maybe Deadpool. And what I say all that to say is that the market is changing these things. Like it's just not. It's too expensive to create a new character and break through in a market that's already like tiny, tiny, tiny. Like the margins for like quote unquote mainstream comics is tiny, you know. So you know,
Right.
yes, a lot of stuff is really about like what the market is dictating. I think,
Yeah.
right?
You
I
know, one
think.
of the things you're saying is reminding me of, like, I tell this story a lot, but when the Ryan Reynolds Green Lantern movie came out, I was
Yep.
teaching a comics class, and a student came to me and said, "Hey, did you see that they made Green Lantern a white guy?" And I was like, "What?" And he's like, "Yeah, you know," and because his frame of reference was John Stewart from the
Right.
Justice League cartoon.
Most people's frame of reference was John
Yeah,
Stewart.
yeah. And I think it's even happened when I've shown like a Nick Fury comic from the
You
60s.
just read my
They're
mind.
like, where when did they make Nick Fury a white guy?
You just read my mind, Andrew.
Right.
Like for instance, I teach I teach in my Afrofuturism class
Yeah,
Deathlock. Sorry, from
yeah.
you know with Dennis Cowan and them and Gwen McDuffie. Yeah, and Nick Fury's in it, and he's white. And so one of my students was like, What's up with Nick Fury being this white?" And I was like, well, that's the Nick Fury that you're reading is his son. Actually. That's what they did. They made him Nick Fury Jr.
Right. They made him Nick Fury Jr. because
And now the original Nick Fury is the Watcher essentially. I'm like, what?
yeah, that's true. And he's not even the Nick Fury. The Nick Fury Jr. is yeah. They basically they made the Nick Fury in the Ultimate Universe. Now again, it's inside baseball, but yeah, the Nick Fury Jr. is a different character that they
Yeah.
created so they wouldn't create so much confusion, right? Because everyone's like Nick Fury is black, and so now when they introduced that character, he didn't even have an eye patch.
Mm-hmm.
Like he like they made him fit. You're like, oh, okay.
Right. Yeah. So that's
Oh,
yeah. So it's really interesting. I mean, this is the politics of it, and it's funny because a lot of it is being affected by the movies. Like for instance, I mean, Blade after Wesley Snipes' Blade just became the movie version of Blade, right? Up until that point, right? I mean, he was maybe not the most coolest character, right? I mean, so like, he was alright, you know. But post Wesley Snipes Blade, man, it's kind of dope.
right.
So
Well, and this gets at I think an important part of a contemporary moment because a lot of the representation that we might associate with contemporary comics, successful examples, many of those aren't necessarily dictated by the comic book shop. Um, that's a legacy distribution system. They're much more connected to alternative frameworks.
That's right.
the graphic novel,
Yep.
the online comic,
Video game.
the web comic, the video game, right? So,
Mhm.
so does that mean that our legitimate level of comics, or the traditional comic book form, can't catch up if we have an audience that's increasingly splintered across multiple kinds of platforms, and they're experiencing, because I, like you, I teach a class, I show students older versions of comics. They don't know who 90% of those characters are.
I really don't.
They know who Superman is, but Jimmy Olsen, who's that?
No one knew who Iron Man was, for God's sake.
Right,
No one
yeah,
knew who
like
Iron Man
really,
was. Except for
right.
they knew who
So,
Robert Downey Jr. was. You know.
right.
Oh,
So,
that's
is should we be paying more attention? This goes back to Andy's point. Should we be paying more attention to the reality of like the transmedia, the media tie-in as a driver of acceptance, and also a standard by which things are being defined,
mm,
right?
so for me, it's like I think there's still a very, very deep love of comics. So I think comics as a medium is wonderful, and there's a lot of independent stuff. But yeah, I mean, the other thing too is like we can't keep thinking of Marvel and DC as comic book companies. That's one thing. They're not comic book companies. They're part of a massive, huge, gigantosaurus rex of like they're just a part of a massive like network of companies and stuff. So you can't even compare like Dark Horse or something to, even though they do have filmmaking and stuff, but you know or Image is starting to, I guess, could starts to go in that place too, because my whole thing is like if you have a TV show about one of your characters, then maybe you're not exactly a comic book, or you're not independent. You're not like, you're starting to become mainstream, that kind of thing. Yeah, you just can't deal with them the same way anymore because they're ubiquitous. They're yeah. I mean, so I think it's something to think about with like transmedia comics, or these different, you know, nodes of representation around those characters, and then like when you talk about representation, like a lot more attention needs to be paid to the Black independent press, because it's bustling. There's a lot of us out here making that work. So, I think there are more authentic representations, and I think in that regard, like a lot of the mainstream comics are just now trying to catch up to that aesthetic, by hiring people who are coming out of um, that particular you know mode of representation, because it reminds me of like when, I mean, to me, like what's happening now, with the Black independent folk moving into like more of a mainstream space. It reminds me of like it's like the British invasion to me. It happened with Vertigo and stuff like that. Like somebody's like, you know what? There's a bunch of folk out here who are making these characters, and they're very talented. Maybe we should hire them to make these characters. What do you think about it? And I think that's what's happening, is that it's a similar thing. It reminds me of like all the Italian artists that got hired to work on all those British books back in the day too. You know what I'm talking? When there's like this massively talented Italian illustrators got hired. That kind of stuff. I think that's what's happening, is that there's a migration of like indie talent, and that is now being picked up by these bigger entities, and I like that. That's good, because that means people are eating. What I'm saying? At the end of the day too, like, people need to eat. And so I really don't like, because there's a lot of political things around this too, like, why are you making this character, and this is this white character, blah blah blah. And I'm like, well, this person also has their own independent book that you probably have never heard of, that you didn't buy. You're gonna buy Cyborg, but you're not gonna buy Super Justice Force. You see what I'm saying? So anyway, I'm sorry. It's difficult for me because, like, I'm scholarly stuff, but I'm also in the middle of the critical making aspect of it, and I have to like look at this imprint stuff too, because now I'm thinking like, I can't, if a brand new voice brings me a book, as opposed to someone who's sold a gajillion copies of a book, you know I gotta go with the person that's making the gajillion, got 9 times out of 10. Because I'm trying to build an institution where people can actually come in and tell the type of stories that they need to tell. You know,
Right.
a lot of pressure on a
And
brother right now.
and taking into account your analogy, when we think about imprints like Vertigo, or we think about the kind of stories where those British invasion writers made their first initial impact, they were often doing that in the context of anthologies or elseworld stories, or stories that weren't necessarily, they're not necessarily given the reins to um, the, the flagship book. They worked their way up to it, right?
Yeah.
And I do think that there's some similarities to this idea that you do see a lot of Black independent comic book writers and artists being given these opportunities, and especially in the case of the big sort of mainstream things, like sort of flagship limited series, future state, I can imagine a number of these things. How many of those people will continue on to more quote unquote mainstream titles that are closer to the publisher's flagship? That is yet to be seen,
We shall
right? And
see.
we're
We shall see.
right. Well, that is
You know,
yet to be seen.
because at the
We're
end of
coming
the day,
up on our the end of this
oh,
this session. We have about 3 minutes, so I want to close by giving each of you an opportunity to sort of sound off of what you think needs to happen in terms of greater representation in comics. I know that's a horrible question, but
no.
given omnipotent power, how would you go about making comics have greater representation?
Well, for me, the first thing I would do is change people's perception of comics. That's the first thing, because for and this goes back to the things we've been talking about, because of the ubiquitous nature of like superheroes right now. People in our country, 9 times out of 10, or maybe 7 times out of 10, are still thinking comic book equals superhero. Right. That's first thing, to realize that genre has been conflated with medium in our country drives me crazy every single time. And I'm like, here's a graphic novel about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. You know what I'm saying? Can you please read that? Or here's a book about John Lewis, that kind of thing, right? Because people still think of comics as superheroes and not as a medium. It's ridiculous to me. I'm like, it's kind of like saying like radio is only for romance, dramas, or like, you know, uh, cable is only for news. No one makes those limitations on it. So that would be the first thing. Fix that first, and then I think you'd be able to actually get more comics into different spaces. I think more is better, because just like stereotypical, the idea of stereotypes, I mean, the more you see people's humanity, the less you think of them as a stereotype. So the more, if you think of comics as not just being for kids, or no, not just being for a particular type of story, I think that helps. So diversity. So diversify, to make better diversity, just keep doing what you're doing and diversify the medium. So that's what I think.
Andy?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything John said, and I think too, doing from my perspective, doing stuff that can be taught, like being able to teach Kindred, or Kyle Baker's Nat Turner,
Yeah.
or even when Far Sector comes out as a collection, being able to insert that into a superhero comics class is going to be great. And that kind of stuff that you can get in through a class, get in the hands of an audience that may not be getting comics otherwise,
Yeah.
and that they can see. I mean, my favorite thing that's ever happened as a teacher is when I teach one of the volumes of Love and Rockets, and I get Latinx students going, "I love this. Where can I get more of this stuff?" And they'd never been exposed to it before. So
Right.
yeah, so that find not only getting this, not only doing the kind of things John says, but getting stuff into the hands of people like like me that teach these things, and get them
And the
out.
parents.
Get them out students. Yeah, yeah.
And the parents, yeah, because they need. That's who's going to buy the books. That's why we started creating these ethnocentric conventions, because I mean, the Schomburg is a really powerful force, and it's yeah, it's a lot of power, when a parent goes in there and they see these characters like that. So
All right. That's a great place to end it. Thank you so much to John, Andy, for sharing your thoughts on representation in comics. We're running 1 minute behind schedule, but we're heading on a break, and we'll be back for our, oh my God, it's our last panel, pedagogy and comics,
Oh man.
at 3:45. So thank you so much for watching. And again, thanks, John. Thanks, Andy, for your great insights.
Oh man, it was a pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Hey,
Thank you.